In this video, we're going to introduce our option for IB higher level chemistry, which is biochemistry. So a lot of the topics that we will be discussing in this option unit, we've covered in biology, but now we're going to look at things from a chemical perspective. So first of all, we're going to take a look at metabolic pathways. So remember that reactions in our body are rarely just one-step reactions. They actually occur in multi-step reaction mechanisms. And the overall process is called a metabolic pathway. So if we take, for instance, this example where the overall change from A to Z is shown, it actually is a metabolic pathway that has many steps. So each of those steps would be catalyzed by a specific enzyme. So A is catalyzed by enzyme B to produce C, which is then catalyzed by enzyme D to produce E, and so on all the way to Z. So again, remember, metabolic pathways are composed of anabolic reactions and catabolic reactions. So anabolism is building molecules from smaller components. So that would be the example on the left. You have a bunch of smaller molecules. You have to put energy in to combine them together to make a larger molecule. So anabolic reactions are endothermic because you have to input energy. And then catabolic reactions is when we're breaking larger molecules down into smaller subunits or components. And that is a exothermic reaction. So again, when we think about building carbohydrates, we have to input energy. We input energy, or we don't, plants do. The energy input is the sun's energy, light energy, to produce carbohydrates from carbon dioxide and water. And then catabolism would be cellular respiration, when we release the energy that had been stored in glucose and other carbohydrates and release that back to smaller components like carbon dioxide and water. So remember that we, humans and other animals and all living things, are mainly composed of water. So all of our reactions are happening in aqueous environment. So remember, the cell cytoplasm is mostly water as well. So because of that, these reactions require a consistent set of conditions. So a slight deviation from that could mean the wrong reaction would take place. So there's a lot of things that will impact how a molecule will interact with other molecules. So the shape of the molecule, when we think about enzymes and active sites, for instance, the structure, even the chirality of a molecule will impact how it interacts with other molecules. So pH matters. The cytoplasm has to be in a buffered environment because some reactions have to happen at a very specific pH. Remember, a lot of the reactions are actually oxidation reduction reactions. Cellular respiration and photosynthesis are redox reactions because there is the transfer of hydrogen and electrons. Some reactions will produce acids or bases as their products, and then that could impact the pH of the cytoplasm. So buffers are essential in the cytoplasm to ensure that the pH stays the same. I included the case study that's found in our textbook because I found it very interesting. So this talks about the pH of our blood and how it is strictly buffered as well. So our pH is buffered at 7.4, and it's done so by the concentration of dissolved carbonate ions, hydrogen carbonate ions, and hydrogen carbonate molecules. The concentration of those ions can be increased or decreased by changing the breathing rate, since carbon dioxide, when it's produced during cellular respiration, reacts with water to form hydrogen carbonate. And hydrogen carbonate, which is a weak diprotic acid, is in equilibrium with both hydrogen carbonate and carbonate ions. So when our blood pH increases or decreases, such as during severe vomiting or certain kidney disorders, the body responds by changing your breathing rate to adjust the concentration of the ions that buffer your blood. This is why we breathe faster during strenuous exercise and why we breathe more slowly when we sleep. So I just thought that might be a fun fact for you to know too. And again, in biology, we learned this already, but temperature matters as well. Temperature can affect the spontaneity of reactions, and it can also affect the functioning of some of our enzymes. Our human body temperature is maintained at around 37 degrees Celsius to allow reactions to occur optimally. And a fun fact, fevers are important actually in allowing reactions to fight disease to occur. So when the illness is over, the temperature will return to normal because those reactions are no longer necessary. So some of the reactions that help us fight disease actually happen at a higher optimal temperature, and that's why we get a fever. It's not necessarily the disease that's causing the fever, it's our body responding to the disease by creating a fever so different reactions can happen. So we're going to take a little bit of time looking at cellular respiration and photosynthesis. And if you remember, those reactions are opposite one another. So the products of one are the reactants of another. So you could basically say that these are actually equilibrium reactions. So it's a balance. So if we look at photosynthesis, remember that photosynthesis uses light energy to store chemical potential energy. So we're using the light to convert a low energy carbon dioxide into a higher energy, like chemical potential energy of glucose. This is an endothermic reaction, and it's anabolic because it builds glucose from smaller components such as carbon dioxide. We make oxygen as a byproduct, which is quite handy to us because we need that to release the chemical potential energy during the process of cellular respiration. So we need both the glucose and the oxygen to be able to release the chemical potential energy. The overall reaction is 6 carbon dioxides plus 6 waters makes a glucose molecule plus 6 oxygen. And the delta H is 20, a positive because it's endothermic, 2,803 kilojoules per mole. So now let's look at respiration. So remember, respiration releases the chemical potential energy to provide energy to drive all the biological functions that have to happen. This reaction is exothermic, so it's releasing energy, as I just said in the last point. It's catabolic because we are breaking glucose down into smaller components and in turn releasing that energy. And carbon dioxide and water are made as byproducts of the reaction, and that's important because we need them as reactants for photosynthesis. And the overall reaction you can see is the reverse. So glucose plus oxygen makes carbon dioxide and water, and the delta H is negative 2,803 kilojoules per mole. So as we can see, it is an exothermic reaction. Now, what happens when we don't have oxygen present? Can we still release energy? And the answer is yes. Respiration can occur in either the presence of oxygen or not. So if we look at this, glucose, if we're animals, we produce lactic acid and some energy, much less energy than for aerobic respiration, as we learned in our cellular respiration unit in biology. But we do release some energy, and we need to produce lactic acid without the presence of oxygen because we need to at least be able to perform glycolysis, and lactic acid will ensure that we can, because if you remember, in lactic acid we convert NADH to NAD plus so that we can then perform glycolysis again. And then plants and yeast convert to ethanol, and it releases 2 carbon dioxides in energy, and it does the same thing. That ethanol will convert NADH to NAD+, which then allows glycolysis to continue. But in both cases, you end up with very minimal energy per mole of glucose. And for animals, the lactic acid production actually is reversible. So you can convert that back to pyruvate and then continue. But with ethanol, because 2 carbon dioxides came off, this is a permanent change. We cannot reverse and go back to pyruvate. So if anaerobic respiration occurs, as I said before, your yield of energy is much lower than if you had done it with oxygen. So condensation reaction. So that is something we talked about a few times in biology. Whenever we're combining two molecules, water is removed to allow for the combination. So one molecule will lose OH. So in this example, if we're combining ethanol and ethene, we take this and then you combine the two together and you end up with ethene plus water. That's a condensation reaction. Or if you take a carboxylic acid and an alcohol, you can take off the hydrogen and the hydroxyl, and then it forms an ester plus water. So one molecule will lose hydrogen and one will lose hydroxide in that example. And then the oppositely charged ions now form a bond, and then these often occur they require heat and an acidic environment for these reactions. So what are biopolymers? So biopolymers are polymers that are from biological compounds. So we can end up forming what are called condensation polymers. So that's when we form starch. So we have many, many subunits combining to form long molecules. So some examples would be complex carbohydrates like starch and cellulose and glycogen. Proteins are condensation polymers or biopolymers, so are nucleic acids. We can also make synthetic polymers in the same manner. For instance, polyester is an example. These are all anabolic reactions and they require energy to form, so they're endothermic. Hydrolysis reactions means water breaking. So water molecules are broken into hydrogen and hydroxide, and the hydrogen ion and hydroxyl are then added to one or two of the molecules. So this requires heat and an acidic catalyst or enzyme to occur as well. And these reactions often involve the breaking of a molecule into two, so they're considered catabolic. So in this example, ethene is undergoing an addition reaction with water. In the last example, in the condensation, ethanol was undergoing a elimination reaction. The second example, we have an ester and sodium hydroxide, and this is a saponification reaction, also a hydrolysis reaction, and you end up with sodium carboxylate and an alcohol. So again, this is just an example. So the forward reaction is showing the condensation reaction, so ethanoic acid and methanol. So what's happening is an OH and an H come off, so then you end up with methyl ethanoate and water. And then the reverse reaction, the water is hydrolyzing the reaction. So it's splitting the molecule and creating methanol and ethanoic acid from methyl ethanoate.